propose, c'est un petit peu de sortir des deux secteurs pour essayer de regarder d'une manière un peu prospective, entre guillemets, à partir de ces deux développements, ce que serait la transformation de l'économie aux États-Unis en particulier, mais de l'économie mondiale, à partir de ce type de développement. Je commencerai par Richard. Qu'est-ce que ces développements, et puisque vous nous avez présenté tout à fait au début, annoncent d'une modification de la... Est-ce qu'on a vraiment, de votre point de vue, donc lâchez-vous, il est 19h, vous êtes fatigué, donc vous pouvez donner un point de vue qui sortira totalement du jugement académique. Est-ce que, de votre point de vue, ces innovations, mais le développement de ces différents produits économiques annoncent, parce que pour l'instant on est dans des produits financiers, dans des sous-secteurs, etc., vraiment un nouveau cycle économique, une nouvelle organisation de l'économie de ces différents continents, puisqu'on parle de continents plus que de pays maintenant, ou pas?
Well, I'm spectacularly unqualified to answer, but I think what's, I mean, I guess my default is perhaps to look backwards, to look forwards. And so, I was born in the 60s, and, and I've looked back at some of the predictions that were made by, people like in the 60s trying to answer questions like this, right? Sort of 30, 40 years hence. And what's very clear is that no one got even close to trying to extrapolate from sort of current technologies, because there are kind of links between what you sort of can do today and what can be done tomorrow that you just can't possibly imagine. So, even sort of a kind of well-known institution like McKinsey, right? They were looking at the mobile phone industry and they were extrapolating on sort of AT&T sort of subscriber figures. I mean, who's AT&T? I mean, and just the very fact that I bring up a name that's sort of, was sort of seen as a sort of world leader 20 years ago. And so, in many ways, I think what's fascinating about this is that given the problem that we are facing is essentially a shared global issue. And there is this thing called climate change that is on a clock that people argue against, where it is on this clock. But the reality is we can't let the markets move. The government has to intervene to a certain extent to make the markets happen. Because right now, what I'm observing is essentially markets that are, the private sector, if you like. And the private sector is sort of interested in the costs of things, right? And right today we have a whole series of technologies that the cost of them is much greater than their substitute today, and therefore there is no rational reason for people to buy. So, if we want to solve the climate change issue, or rather maybe from an insurance point of view, if we can't actually take the risk of getting it wrong, then, I think we need to get into some radical transformation type of project. So, what could that world look like? There's a couple of ways to look at it. One way is to look at it and say, from an energy point of view, in 10 to 20 years' time, don't expect too much change. From an energy mix of the world's point of view, you will find that we are still using the same energies as we are using today. What I hope will have changed will be that certain technologies will be on a radical trajectory to change in the same way that sort of computers and semiconductors have taken up a massive curve. But I think the fascinating thing about your subject, mobility, is that, in some ways it's the cities. If you think about where the problem lies and where carbon dioxide emissions are coming from, where you think the populations are, and therefore where the then you think forward and you say to yourself, okay, well actually, what's interesting about sitting here or sitting in most places when I visit my job is the problem is actually more in the so-called developing world than it is here, because the rise of population, which is one of the huge drivers here of the demand of energy, is not happening in the West. It's happening everywhere else. And so if you want to think about transportation mobility, I encourage you to think in this group about India and think about China and how they're going to move around. Because at the moment we are still developing, they're still developing old technologies that are going to make the problem worse and they're going to make it quicker. And so I guess, back to Vincent was making an observation about being stuck in the 60s, that I think there is this danger. We are in a world that looks after its own, whether you're looking at it economically or whether you're looking at it politically, etc., etc. And so I sort of defer slightly back to my previous comment about we are actually in a fascinating 2-year period where we are going to spend a lot of our money. We've already spent kind of a lot of the private sector's money, and we're now got a chance to spend more of our own, not just saving banks, but actually transforming our economies. And this is a very serious point because the way we do it can lay the path to a very different way of being, or it can protect the status quo and lock in the technologies for the next decade or two. And if you think about, a statistic like in the next, by 2030, 70 to 80% of the capacity of energy generation hasn't been built yet. If you think about most of the building stock of the world that we're worried about in the next 20 years hasn't been built yet, there is actually an incredible opportunity to transform the world in the way in which we work. However, I'm honest as an individual, I'm very fearful we will lock in a very different form of technology.
Vincent Coffrin, je vous vois acquiescer. Je vous laisse commenter et compléter les points sur lesquels vous êtes d'accord.
Moi, je posais la question un petit peu naïvement, je ne sais pas du tout le domaine, donc j'écoute la réponse avec intérêt et circonspection.